that is being used as a replacement for animal therapy in nursing homes, which is really kind of awesome.
So she builds planets on Earth, you guys.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Yeah, make some noise. It's a Wednesday night. I'm James Monroe. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the senior producer of adult programs and theater experiences here at the museum. Welcome to the Museum of Science and to our very special program tonight, Portraits of Pride. We are here to celebrate tonight the incredible exhibition, Portraits of Pride, which has been up in City Hall Plaza this entire month of June. And we're so thrilled to be collaborating and partnering with its creative director and executive producer, Jean Dolin. And this is our second time collaborating with Jean. We had the honor back in October on an event called Rainbow Tales to celebrate LGBTQ History Month. And so we were really honored when he accepted our invitation to come back this year and to create a public program to celebrate all the work that he's doing with Portraits of Pride. And I want to start tonight off with a huge thank you to Jean and invite him to actually say a few words. So please give him a round of applause and welcome out to the stage, Jean Dolin.
Thank you. Thank you, James. Good evening, guys. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for spending your Wednesday evening with us. I am excited and thrilled to be bringing Portraits of Pride to the Museum of Science, but really through the stories of the folks that are honored in the exhibit. When I started the project back in 2021, the goals were to pay respect to LGBTQ leaders who have done the work for decades, and to also create a space, a platform for stories to be told and for history to be exhumed. And I am very intentional about making sure, in addition to the photos that are captured by the wonderful, talented, masterful John Huet, who is here tonight. Thank you, John. I can't see you. In addition to the photos, to create a space for you to hear from them what pride means to them, how pride really filters to the work that they do and the lives that they live. So tonight we have 4 amazing speakers, amazing leaders who do different things in different spaces, and you'll get to understand why I'm so inspired to continue this work, because they are the reason that I'm inspired to continuing doing it. Thank you for being here, and we're just going to have a wonderful night, and we're just going to enjoy ourselves. That's it, really. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. And thank you to our incredible guest speakers and honorees who are going to be taking the stage in just a few moments. I can't wait for you to meet all of them. Like I said, tonight is a part of our summer season of adult programming. We have a great lineup after tonight, something basically every week now through the end of August. So I encourage you to check out that lineup by going to our website at mos.org/adults, or you can pick up our season mailer on your way out tonight as well. At the end of our program tonight, all of our special guests will have the opportunity to take questions from all of you. So whether you're here with us in Connors Theater or watching at home, thank you for tuning in. You can submit a question at any time by pulling out those smartphones and going to slido.com, SLIDO.com, and enter the code Portraits of Pride, all one word, just as it appears on the screen right now. We'll get through a bunch of those a little bit later on. But now I'm excited to bring up to the stage another very special guest tonight. She is the inaugural Chief People Officer here at the Museum of Science Boston and is our host and moderator for this evening. Please join me in welcoming to the stage 𝗣𝗍𝗄𝗏.
Hello, everyone. This is really exciting. There's so much going on at the Museum of Science, and it is an absolute pleasure for me to be here with you today. As James says, my name is 𝗍𝗍𝗄𝗏. I am the inaugural Chief People Officer here at the museum, and this position was created to be able to continue the work that we're doing here tonight and these partnerships. And not only do we think about our staff, over 350 staff members, we've got interns, we've got volunteers. Sign up, go online, look at our fabulous events and our fabulous opportunities here. But we also talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, and belonging. And the museum recently published a statement of commitment. This statement of commitment shares our beliefs and our commitment to DEAIB. I'm not going to read you the entire statement of commitment, but I will share with you some really powerful commitments that includes creating experiences for all, forming meaningful partnerships, listening to and learning from the community, building a staff and board that increasingly reflect the diverse community, and working actively against racism, discrimination, and bias. Those commitments are why I am here. I am here to make an impact alongside an organization that sees me, a place where I can come every day and be my authentic self as a Puerto Rican Latina who is proud to be part of the LGBTQIA+ community. This evening is a product of this commitment, our true commitment to collaborations and our true commitment to partnerships. So thank you, Jean, and the Portraits of Pride team for seeing us and seeing our potential in this amazing partnerships, and of course, to James, who is teaching me so much about all of the important work that we can do here. I now have the pleasure of introducing 2 videos welcoming us all here this evening.
Happy Pride, everyone. Pride's a celebration of who you are and who you love, a celebration of loud, colorful, unapologetic joy. Each June, I think about how far this community has come. I think about the shoulders we stand on, the activists, the trailblazers who paved the way for people to live as their full, authentic selves. This year, Pride comes at a time when our community faces a nationwide onslaught of anti-gay, anti-trans legislation. With book bans, drag bans, restrictions on healthcare and history books, they're trying to turn back the clock on LGBTQ+ rights. That's not how we do things in Massachusetts. So many of our victories were won here first. We laid the groundwork for marriage equality nationwide. We protect people from discrimination, and we preserve access to gender-affirming care. I'm proud to be part of that history, to be able to open doors for other LGBTQ+ people, women, and anyone who's been left behind and out of the conversation for far too long. I'm honored to be the first, but I know I won't be the last. So on behalf of Lieutenant Governor Kim Driscoll and myself, thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for your work in making Massachusetts a place where we celebrate inclusivity and diversity. And I wish all of you and your families a happy Pride.
Hi everyone, it's Mayor Michelle Wu wishing you a happy Pride. It's my honor to welcome you all to tonight's event, Portraits of Pride Through Narratives. I want to thank all of tonight's speakers for the work you do to strengthen, celebrate, and empower our LGBTQ+ community. And I'd like to thank the Museum of Science for hosting tonight's event and partnering with Portraits of Pride to support this important exhibit. Earlier this month, I had the privilege of kicking off Boston's Pride Month on City Hall Plaza with members of our LGBTQ+ community. It was an event filled with joy and love, and also a sense of resolve. A resolve to live up to the revolutionary history of Pride, to not hesitate or let up in our work to create a Boston where our queer family, friends, and loved ones are safe, seen, and celebrated. We're so grateful to Jean Dolin, Creative Director of Portraits of Pride, and photographer John Huet for helping us do that, seeing and celebrating and putting together the striking exhibit that has graced City Hall Plaza all month long. Portraits of Pride is a reminder of the leadership, elegance, and power that exists across our LGBTQ+ community. And I'm so glad you're here to be a part of tonight's important conversations. Happy Pride.
That was a great welcoming. So now we get to hear from these amazing speakers. What they'll do is they'll come up, I'll introduce them. I'm gonna read from here very closely because the work that they do is amazing and I don't wanna miss one bit. They're going to come up for about 10 minutes, and then we'll be able to, reminder that we'll be able to ask questions in the end. So if you can get your Slido out and start typing in some questions, and I'll be able to have a great conversation with them. So first up, we have 𝗧𝗵𝗿𝗁, a Vietnamese-American queer and trans drag performer who has been active in Boston for over 7 years and hopes her art inspires others to love themselves and know they aren't alone. She has previously worked at MAP for Health, which is an organization that is dedicated to improving AAPI sexual health education on topics such as HIV and STDs. She also worked with Bagley, Providence Youth Student Movement, 𝗣𝗿𝗁, Fenway Health, Mass General Hospital. She's currently at the Mayor's Office of LGBTQ+ Advancement as one of the Community Relations Specialists. Please welcome to the stage 𝗧𝗵𝗿𝗁.
Hi everyone, how are y'all? How are we doing tonight? Great, okay. I have a little notes for y'all. Speaking is not my strongest suit. I'm very behind the scenes when I'm not performing. So please forgive me for any grammar or anything like that. But that's not important. The important is what is pride and what does that mean to me. So my name is Candace and I use she, her pronouns in and out of drag. And for someone who identifies as both being queer and Asian, coming out to families is very stressful. And that coming out process is stressful for family members as well because you believe that your family's pride and happiness is more important. For immigrants and refugee families, oftentimes there's this unset debt that we owe to our families for bringing us over here to the United States to have a better life, right? And then just, I think, finding out a family member who's queer or trans is stressful because they deal with this process of their internalized prejudice, especially with like language barriers and cultural barriers. And in the Vietnamese language, there's not a lot of positive words to describe anyone's queerness. The word I learned growing up was 𝗣𝗿𝗁𝗁, which derives from a French word, which then meant pedophilia. And I think I get why like family members wouldn't want to accept this, right? Like they don't want to have to be a part of this if that's the only word they knew of. So I wanted to take some time to share a video of my mom that I created back in college. And I asked her the simple question, how was it like for her when I came out to her? And so it is in Vietnamese, but there are some captions for y'all. And then I'll just continue talking after that.
Mẹ hỏi con mới nói mẹ con bị thế sao?
Má không thích vậy, ai không muốn vậy, má không nghĩ chuyện đó xảy ra. Nhưng mà mọi người họ đều nói cho mẹ biết, nhưng mẹ không cần thiết, mẹ không cần nghe họ, mẹ chỉ thương con. Buồn nữa, tại vì số phận của con vậy thôi, mẹ chấp nhận, thương con nhiều hơn. Mấy anh con cũng vậy, thương con lắm, ai họ cũng biết trước mẹ hết. Chỉ có mình mẹ là người biết cuối cùng. Nhưng mà thôi, mẹ chỉ khóc thôi, chứ không biết làm gì hồi đó nữa. Nên là lần lần cũng quen rồi, từ nó quen. Nhưng mà mẹ thấy con học hành được, mẹ cũng rất mừng. Mẹ con của mẹ rất giỏi, không đi đây đi đó. Hai, mẹ thương lắm. Giờ thì con đã 20 mấy tuổi rồi, 25 tuổi rồi. Khi mà mới biết chuyện con xảy ra là con mới có 12 tuổi. Con lại là con là của mẹ. Lúc nào mẹ cũng thương con. Nhưng mà con phải giữ gìn sức khỏe và lo cho công ăn việc làm của con tới ngày con trưởng thành. Lúc nào con cũng là con của mẹ. Mẹ không bao giờ bỏ rơi con. Mẹ thương con nhiều hơn. Các anh có kể con cũng thương con. Nhưng mà họ biết Ví dụ bên đây câu họ biết trước mà mẹ mới biết, khi mà mẹ biết được là mẹ muốn chết thì mẹ xỉu luôn. Những cái đó mẹ không có giàu có, mẹ không có cho con tiền của gì hết, nhưng mà con đi học là bền vững của con, tương lai của con. Đến khi con 3, 4, 5, 60 tuổi, con sẽ biết có công ăn việc làm đàng hoàng, của ai khinh bỉ mình. Mẹ rất mừng. Trước khi mẹ có đi ra khỏi đời này, mẹ cũng nói mấy anh mấy chị thương con nhiều hơn.
Shout out to my mother, who taught me to work hard. And just to want to do a little plug, as of right now, June is our huge Pride Month, and it's a huge time for drag performers. So in a span of 19 days, I've done 30 performances. So a queen is tired. I still have a 9 to 5, so I still got to get up and do my job in my little office. So for queer and trans folks, coming out is a series of doors we never stop opening. And trans women, we have a different relationship to womanhood. And trans women and cisgender women may not share the same experiences, but I think it's an indication of how vast womanhood is. And we all have all kinds of bodies. And trans women like me had to work hard to be recognized for who we are. And looking back, I grieve the child that was never given the space or opportunity to play with who I was with ease or with safety. So I had to create this own version of myself, and I had to let go of what people needed me to be. And I feel like oftentimes people project a version of you that's the most comfortable for them. And through that, I've learned that it's better to disappoint them than disappointing yourself. Thank you. Looking back at my journey, as mentioned before, I was this queer kid growing up in Dorchester and have continuously contributed back to our community, from being a program manager at MAP, from being a co-chair at Bagley, to being a clinical coordinator at Fenway Health, providing free STD and PrEP navigation, to helping trans and gender non-binary folks at MGH getting gender-affirming surgery, to now serving as one of the community relations specialists for Mayor's Office of LGBTQ Advancement, also known as MOLA. And this is where I switch on my MOLA hat and talk about the work that we've done at City Hall. The onboarding was very affirming for me, especially with the office, who was very supportive. But I ran into an issue where my city employees' email was in fact using my dead name. And for folks who don't know, using a dead name is when someone, intentionally or not, uses a name of a trans person by the name that they used before they transition. And since our department's creation was only a year ago, we worked really hard to get that change, as well as looking into collecting gender identity data, like looking if that is actually necessary. So we have been creating a playbook to encourage departments to look into if gender and sexuality is actually needed before, or if this will block any service of delivery. And if you can't find a good reason, I think it's just simple that you just don't collect it. We looked at our marriage license process specifically, which only offers male or female options, which then forces our constituents to choose options that didn't identify with who they are. And so our team worked on removing those gender options if you're looking to get married. And we also have developed and launched an LGBTQ competency training, which we hope to train all 18,000 employees on the importance of pronouns and gender identity and respecting people. Our team is building a set of new standards that guides when and how we should collect our information. And then this brings us closer to our goal, which is a more inclusive city for all. Language matters. So recently, I've learned through TikTok that the word for trans in Vietnamese is người chân giới, which directly translates to a person crossing worlds. And that is a better definition than what we learned earlier. With over 400 anti-LGBTQ bills being passed in state ledgers, with all the hate crimes on the rise in both Massachusetts and the rest of the country, there is a greater pressure to cultivate inclusivity and safety for our community. Silence normalizes and allows the terror that happens to Black and brown folks. People are often policed on how we should act, how we talk, and a lot of lingo and slang that we use currently, like throwing shade or sipping tea or yes. These were all terms created by Black and brown queer folks. And cis straight folks are quick to use these terms, but are silent when queer folks are asking for help. So when improving the support, I think about the fact that my story isn't a story that is often told. Many trans women's story end in violence, and I owe it to the women that came before me to make sure that that cycle of violence doesn't continue. Our safety, our mental health is often occupied with a fear of belonging and being targeted. And I think about how little Candace and how I am personally and professionally making these changes so that future generations, they won't have to feel what we felt. I want to share a quote with y'all from a TV show called Veneno. It's just the story of a transgender woman who is a singer and television personality. The show focuses on trans women coming together, and there's a quote that has stayed with me ever since I watched the show. It says, "Some have no luck because we all have different stories, but still deep down, we are all the same. At some point in our lives, we fought the same struggles. We had the same struggles of justice. We had the same surgeries, the same pain, and the same dreams. When united, we can do anything, because in the end, that's our luck, the luck of having each other." And so just wanted to close out to say that together, we can end trans misogyny, we can end religious discrimination, and we can fight against racism. Thank you.
Thank you, Candace. That is so, that was really inspiring and really amazing to watch. Up next, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Scott Hadland, the Chief of Adolescent and Young Adult Medicine at the Massachusetts General Hospital, an Associate Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. He is a doctor who holds triple board certification in general pediatrics, adolescent medicine, and addiction medicine. Dr. Hadland's clinical care, research, and advocacy focus on youth, physical, and mental health, and he is a tireless advocate for LGBTQ+ youth across the country. Please welcome Dr. Scott Hadland.
Thank you. You'll have to forgive me. I'm an academic, so I like to use slides. As we just heard, I think my mic may not be. Oh, there we go. All right. As we just heard, I head up the adolescent medicine services at Mass General Hospital, and we have a clinic that cares for thousands of youth between the ages of about 13 and 30. And I have many special patients. I love them all. I have one patient in particular who is very dear to me, who I've known for about 6 years now. And we had this encounter last year that really struck me. It wasn't much more than a conversation, but it took place in February of last year. And this was a conversation I was having with Ethan, a 26-year-old gender non-binary person who works as a middle school teacher here in the area. And what they said to me was, you know, it's just really hard being an LGBTQ+ professional in America right now. And just 2 weeks earlier, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis had signed in Florida's Don't Say Gay bill. And about a month before that, Texas's Attorney General Ken Paxton had basically made it equivalent to child abuse if a parent had presented for gender-affirming care for their minor child. And so it was a really tough time. These policies were so hurtful to Ethan and me, not just because of the harm that they do to young people, but because of the way in which they take LGBTQ plus professionals and put us right in the targets of the culture wars. And this is at a time when, we had just come out of COVID, or we were actually right in the middle of COVID, and young people needed us more than ever, and yet it was becoming harder and harder for us to do our work. Ethan shared with me, and I shared back with Ethan, and I've heard from my colleagues all across town and across the country that increasingly we hear a lot of words thrown at us when we're LGBTQ plus professionals, words like pedophile or groomer. People conflating the idea that because we identify as an LGBTQ plus person and work with young people, that somehow we're causing harm to them just by virtue of our identity. And so these have just been really difficult times for so many of us. But it's really not about us, it's about the young people. And this is a map of what's going on in the United States right now. So we heard from Governor Healey, and we also heard from Candace just now, about the many hundreds of anti-LGBTQ plus laws that are going into effect across the country. Many of them aren't actually getting passed. Many of them are just creating unfortunate and terrible discourse that young people have to listen to. But some of them are passing. We're at a point now where the ACLU has identified that there's nearly 500 of these across the United States. And the problem with these bills is not just that they cause harm to young people when they're passed, but the mere fact that young people hear the dialogue that surrounds these bills, it hurts them. Right? These bills send the message, no matter what the particular law is, these bills send the message to a young person that to be LGBTQ plus is something so bad it has to be prevented through policy, that there's something wrong with being LGBTQ plus, something that needs to be hidden away, something that can't be in our schools or in our healthcare environments. And so if you think about young people, at the time that Ethan and I had this conversation, it was really Florida and Texas that were kind of, the heart of our country's conversation. Those two states alone have more than 300,000 LGBTQ plus adolescents living in them that had to listen to that dialogue. And so because this is about the youth, and with that as the backdrop, it's important for us to understand that the mental health of young people is not in a great place coming out of the pandemic and then entering into this wave of anti-LGBTQ plus legislation. So the CDC reported that in 2021, 1 in 5 lesbian, gay, and bisexual adolescents had a suicide attempt. And these rates are even higher among trans and gender diverse youth, among whom these rates are about 1 in 3. And among all LGBTQ plus identifying youth, about 2 out of every 3 nationwide report that the mere dialogue that's taking place around this legislation, whether or not it passes, has hurt their mental health. And for each of these proportions that I've just presented, the numbers are even more troubling when it comes to youth of color who are struggling even more in this terrible context that's been created for us all. And so with that as the backdrop, I want to say a little bit about what pride means to me. This is something that Jean asked me early on in this whole process. And it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And there's 2 things that really rise to the surface for me. It's the idea of paying it back and paying it forward. And we heard a little bit about paying it back from Governor Healey. She said, we use this month to acknowledge those that came before us, that did the hard work, laying the groundwork so that somebody like me can live and work as a pediatrician and be an out gay man in doing so, that I can be married to my husband, that I can have 2 children, and that we can live a happy and healthy life and have enormous well-being and quality of life together. So we pay back. We acknowledge the hard work that came before us, and we pay respect to that. But we also need to pay it forward. And this is where I think we really need to stand up for youth right now. I want to highlight a couple of things, or a few things I think that we can do to help young people in a time when they're hearing a lot of negative messaging. Not everybody likes the word ally. I've put it here because it happens to start with A, which makes for a great title. Adults as allies and advocates. Some people prefer the term co-conspirator. And I think the bottom line is we got to be all in to help the young people. This is the way in which we pay forward and give thanks for the work that has come before us. Young people need us to show our love. Young LGBTQ plus people thrive when they're supported. Just to give a couple of data points, so we talked a little bit about some of the high rates of attempted suicide among young people. Well, young people, according to the Trevor Project, who are in schools that support them, rates of attempted suicide are 40% lower if they are in a context in which they feel loved and supported. As another example, when states across the US began to implement same-sex marriage laws in the early 2000 teens, states that implemented those policies saw drops in youth suicide rates of about 7% across those states, demonstrating again that when we create supporting places for people to live, people thrive in them. If you're an LGBTQ plus person, and particularly if you're a professional, be the adult that many of us never had. I didn't have role models growing up that I could look to, and I know that's true for so many other people as well. Now that I'm a doctor and have the honor of getting to work with young people, I think sometimes it's as important that I'm their doctor and looking out for their health and well-being as it is that I'm an out gay professional that they can see living and working in the world. And if you're not LGBTQ+, if you're an ally, radiate kindness and affirmation, because we live in a time right now where I and so many other people, I think, find ourselves feeling as though trust is tanking, right? I don't feel the same confidence that I did a few years ago that when I enter into spaces, I'm going to be affirmed. And I think so many of us feel that. Young people in particular feel it because of the national dialogue that's taking place right now. And I want to highlight, too, that this needs to be not just inside Massachusetts, but outside Massachusetts. And there's a couple of considerations here. Sometimes I think that when we live in Massachusetts, we think, all right, we're good, we're doing all right. Well, 3 weeks ago, the church that my husband and kids and I all go to in Jamaica Plain was vandalized with homophobic slurs during Pride Month, right in the heart of Jamaica Plain. So we have work to do in Massachusetts as well. But we also can't let down our guard for people outside of Massachusetts. I think another thing that we often will hear is people will say, well, that's what you get for living in Texas, or that's what you get for living in Florida. No, many people don't get to choose the places that they live, and the health and well-being of everybody across this country is our collective responsibility. And so we all have to stand up. And so I just want to wrap up by talking a little bit about my portrait. I don't love talking about myself, so I tried to deflect by talking about the public health problem. A question I've been asked a few times is, what did it feel like? Sorry, I have trouble looking at this picture. People have asked, what did it feel like when you saw the picture for the first time? And as you can tell, I saw it with my son the first time that I saw it. And I remember when I was thinking about becoming a doctor, I was told when you were interviewing for medical school, you should never tell anybody you're gay. That's like the kiss of death. You'll never get in. And then I got into medical school, and when I was on my rotations and trying to get a good grade, you always were doing the calculation of, should I share with this person who I am? Should I tell them I've got a boyfriend, or is that going to hurt my grade? And then when I interviewed for residency, it was the same thing. And then I finally became a doctor, and I found myself doing the calculation every time I met with a family. Should I share a little bit of my identity with them, or will they worry about what this means? Have they heard these old tropes that LGBTQ plus people who work with young people are pedophiles? And so I was constantly doing this calculation, and somehow I feel like I've finally come out on the other end of this. And so when I saw this picture and I was with my son, I thought, I finally made it. And now I want to work so hard so that other people can make it as well. Sorry, these tears were not planned. And I want to wrap up by just highlighting that, we live in a time when there's so much to be really discouraged about. And I really want to thank Jean and John, wherever he is. I know he's around here somewhere, because you two so beautifully embody the spirit of something, and that is that to be LGBTQ plus is to shine, to love, to exude kindness, and we live in difficult times, but there's a lot of joy in what we do as well. And I think Portraits of Pride just so beautifully depicts the amazing work that people are doing to share that kindness. And so I just really want to thank you. And I want to wish you all a very happy Pride in our last couple of days. Thank you.
be hugging everybody in between all of these things, but that was beautiful, and from both of these speakers that we've had so far is really about that shine, which is certainly what we're here doing, which is pretty amazing. So we're going to keep everything moving. We're going to keep everything moving forward, and we get to welcome our next guest, 𝗍𝗫𝗁, president and founder of 𝗍𝗫𝗁 Consulting, Inc. 𝗍𝗫𝗁 is a social ecosystem engineer with a 21-year track record of success in fields of strategy, politics, organizational development, urban planning, and equity research. Please welcome 𝗍𝗫𝗁.
Good evening, everybody. Is my microphone on? Everyone can hear me? All right, awesome. So I'm actually going to do something that I normally don't do, which is I usually have, a table talk presentation, right, where I have like my speech already rehearsed, and I've been like trying it out with my team for a while. And what I'm actually going to ask you guys to do, in the spirit of pride, because of what it means to me, is to come to my kitchen table. And this is actually literally my kitchen table in my home, right? And the reason I'm bringing it into this tonight is that my kitchen table is where my vulnerability lives. Often when I'm there, my friends, my family always say, we need to write that down. And I'm like, well, I'm not writing that down. That's not the stuff that I share out loud. Those are the things that I keep inside of me, that I let out when I kind of have to, but not really, right? But at the end of the day, it's actually what drives me. So tonight at the Museum of Science, I want to invite all of you just to, sit at this kitchen table with me. Imagine the spread of your favorite foods, music, spirits, whatever they might be. Growing up, I loved playing, whether it was Legos, playing basketball, loved the YW, math and science, and even got my first taste at collective change at 15 years old. I banded together with my classmates to protest the school dress code. We actually skipped first periods for months to prove the point and showed up in the true looks that we really had. When we started out, we were just a small band of students. Some of us called us just a bunch of bad, quote-unquote, bad apples. But then more and more students started joining us in the cafeteria. And then a few of us figured out, AKA I was one of them, that if the rest of the AP kids joined us too, what could the administration do? They might be forced to actually listen to us. Ultimately, we took down the school uniform policy for all high school students in the district, and that was a compromise, because we wanted to do it for everybody, but they were like, we can't do it for everybody. And we're like, okay, all right, we'll stop there. And the reason I'm sharing these early childhood experiences, it's because they taught me early the importance of exercising and holding patience as a critical conduit to making progress. And sometimes, even along the journey, it doesn't mean that you're gonna win, but it's the process that teaches you where you need to go next. It taught me that my agency comes from the embodiment of my self-expression. Whether we have shared interests, language, or culture, it taught me that in a collective, the power and the ability of making observations as a practice was essential, not only so that I can protect myself and understand my own sense of safety, but so that I can understand people's relationship to themselves and to each other, and as part of a group and as part of a community. Because you see, as a queer Dominican and Puerto Rican teenager growing up in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and at that time, deeply in the proverbial closet, these early life lessons, they gave me the courage to often return to a source of care and inspiration. That no matter what stages of my life, that I could always draw back, even at moments when I felt the most fear or when I felt the most imposter syndrome. And it's become a ritual for me now to think about provocations that people, leaders, and teams need to access mindsets to think more creatively, abundantly, and justly about what is possible. You see, they have desires, ideas, norms, and practices that feel in line with a more just world, but reaching them, it often feels elusive or reactionary at best, especially from 9 to 5. I bring this capacity to the work I do every day, helping clients explore the policy and the historical context of their impact, and most importantly, to understand that so they can better identify the needs and assets of their community and their stakeholders. So why do I share all that? It's not because I'm gonna talk about what I do for a living, actually, not fully. Because tonight I actually wanna invite you guys to a provocation, to unpack it with me and for yourself, whatever that means. And that provocation is the following. We're living through a crucible moment in our country's public commons. And the critical role that ecosystem engineers are playing and could play in the possibilities of future is something that we need to talk about. Because you see, and we've heard it from everyone and we hear it from everyone, we're being tested every day in what feels like the trial of the century. Every day that passes, it becomes less clear who belongs on the defense team or the prosecution team, or who or what is exactly the transgression that brought us here. Because you see, the same country that came to a pause in the spring of 2020 with the unfortunate murder of George Floyd, later that November, we witnessed the highest turnout election for any Republican president in American history. The same social media platforms that gave us Black Lives Matter and Me Too, and to be clear, there's real people behind that. It wasn't just the social media platforms, have now become tools of information manipulation. And unfortunately, our national and local news continues to hemorrhage workers and values. The very social movements that gave us the kind of social contract for LGBTQIA rights, while they may feel protected here in Massachusetts, unfortunately, when we look across the country, across social movements, most of them are hobbled, or even worse, they're gentrified. To the point where political leaders clearly don't have a strategy to protect us, and especially when you look at our transgendered friends, our undocumented immigrants and family. The governance and the cultural response to the pandemic revealed all the truth that we needed to know about our lives and our future. Austerity politics has left us barren. And that's an especially hard truth to swallow as we live through the toxic realities of climate change and bigotry. But here's a provocation. And I'm gonna share two quotes from two very different thinkers. Some of you might not agree with either. So first, economic theorist, William Foster Lloyd. He would have called this a tragedy of the commons. Individuals with access to a public resource act in their own interests, in doing so, ultimately depleting the resource. On the other hand, we got feminist and philosopher, Audre Lorde, who would radically remind us that the master's tools, quote unquote, will never dismantle the master's house. I believe that they both can be right. Because you see, in the public commons that we're living in today, some ecosystem engineers leverage their self-interest and their master's tools for their own greed, benefit, and self-preservation. But both Lloyd and Lorde helped me understand that self-interest and white supremacy works within us and hand in hand with each other. Together, they plunder our shared resources or neglect the dignity of others. They shape our individual and collective experience or our relationships to one another. And in many cases, over and over again, effectively deferring equity and justice. We can go ahead and debate the metrics, the frameworks, the merits, or even the very existence. But tonight, for me, it's really about sharing the importance of ecosystem engineers and the ability to deliver a more just and equitable public commons. Those are the portraits that we see in the Portrait of Pride. We're always looking for this big leader to come that somehow is going to swoop in. But it's the people that are doing the work every day to change our habitats, our human habitat. Because you see, in the ecological habitat, ecosystem engineers, they're both living and non-living organisms. They can be beavers, they can be otters, they can be a coral system, it can be a soil system. But they can either sustain the habitat, destroy it, or change it. But when they do that, they impact the availability of resources for other species. Think about what Elon Musk has done to Twitter. Think about what that's done to activism and social media. Think about what that's done for grassroots movements that just 15 years ago figured out an algorithm that the other side didn't, and now it's been decimated. So for ecosystem engineers like me, who dedicate ourselves to continuously learning the knowledge, the culture, the relationships, that generate the conditions and actions to deliver a more just world over time. Because you see, we understand something. We understand that people live in circular habitats of interconnected worlds, identities, and if we're persistent enough, we can unlock the assets in between us in the commons. And our jobs in unlocking that is to catalyze the kinds of production and designs that actually gives us the solutions for equity. It's how time and time again, I've delivered what many have thought is impossible. Some might think that the special sauce is me, but it's not. It's project, place, and people specific. It takes rigor, commitment, and it's multidisciplinary. We're facilitators, we're healers, we're artists, we're strategists. As you can see, we are many things. But often, we're considered the non-technical partner. We're the misfits in the larger knowledge paradigm, in the market economy. But this is what I know. Whether it's working with policy advocates and activists to stop Uber and Lyft from selling out workers in the Commonwealth, or helping elect dozens of women and people of color to political office, or making sure that teams in the public sector and in the nonprofit sector have the strategies and resources that they need to account and solve for equity, the biggest lesson I've learned is the following. We already know that there's no silver bullet, but the possibility of living in a more just world is possible. It just requires a constant commitment of learning, unlearning, love, discernment, and rest. Wash, repeat, and recycle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Winelia. That was amazing. Last but not least, and before we are able, again, just reminding you all of Slido and some questions, we get to bring to the stage Reverend Dr. Brandon Thomas Crowley, a pastor, a preacher, author, and scholar in African American church studies and Black theology. Since 2009, has served as the senior pastor of the historic Myrtle Baptist Church in West Newton, Massachusetts. He's a lecturer in ministry studies at Harvard University Divinity School. Please welcome to the stage, Reverend Crowley.
Good evening. I am so excited to be here. Thank you to the Museum of Science, to Jean for your amazing work with Portraits of Pride. My husband and I were absolutely honored to be a part of this year's exhibit and to be a part of this conversation. So I want to begin by telling you that I love the Black church. And I don't mean this in any disrespectful way to other faith traditions who are gathered in this place, because I actually believe that religion is just a cultural expression of one particular context's way of understanding God. But I also want to say I love Jesus. And the reason I want to put those two together is because I also want to mess with you when I say that not only do I love the Black church, but I love Black Jesus. Because the church that I was raised in was not the white evangelical right-wing church that we hear often in the news today, but it was a church that was a part of the beginning of the civil rights movement. It was a church that was huge in the meaning-making process of enslaved Africans who were brought from West Africa to this country, to this what they called a new world, but was already occupied before genocide was plagued throughout the land. The Black church was a space where Black people whose bodies and minds and souls had been battered and beaten by enslavers in this country, they could gather together and no longer be Toby or Minnie, but they transitioned into Deacon Johnson and Reverend Gilmore, often taking the last names of their enslavers, thereby living into a dream of hope and overcoming. That's the Black church that I was born into. But not only do I love the Black church because of its theology, I also love the Black church because of the Black church experience that I had growing up as a kid. I'm talking good music. gospel music, live gospel music with a full band every Sunday. Not only that, but church ladies wearing their hats, wearing their finest attire to come to church on Sunday morning. Many of these women were blue-collar workers, but you would think they were multi-millionaires when they stepped out of their cars adorning these beautiful crowns. This was a way of civilizing themselves in the face of a country that disrespected them constantly. The black church for me was a magical place. It was a magical place where black Jesus lived. Because the Jesus on our back wall in my church was a black man. The Jesus down the street at the white church was blonde-haired and blue eyes, but we were taught in our Afrocentric theology that Jesus was black. He had hair like wool, skin like bronze. That's what we call a black man. But more than this idea of the black church as being this magical place, the black church was something that taught me what it meant to be black. So I took the church home. I always knew I wanted to be a preacher. Ever since I can remember, the one thing that I knew I loved, two things, I loved the church and I loved men. I've known that since the first time that I could think anything. I absolutely love Jesus, and I absolutely love the messages that Jesus taught, because what I was taught was that Jesus was constantly focused on overturning tables and transgressing boundaries. That when people were stigmatized for being lepers or being women caught in consistent menstrual cycles, that the society and culture would shun them, but Jesus would welcome them in. That Jesus was always challenging the religious order to say, let's rethink the way that we have socio-culturally and historically viewed these living beings. So I took the black church home and I drove my family crazy. I would line up all my teddy bears, and then I would line up all the cars. I had about 1,000 Matchbox cars. My grandfather got me a little miniature organ, a little miniature piano. He stole a couple of choir robes from the church, from the senior choir, and all of my friends, when they would come over to my house, we played church. I loved playing church. It was where I found so much joy, and I even took it out on the porch. But I had this thing that I would do when playing church in my grandmother's living room. I would do it wearing her high heels. It started off because the little podium that my grandfather had made, my great-grandfather, I couldn't really stand up and be seen over it to the fake teddy bears and fake congregation that was on the other side. And so I started wearing her high heels, but then I started liking the way that it felt. And I would wear them around the house, and my cousins would laugh at me, and my grandmother would say, pay them no attention. My grandfather would say, Mamie, you need to stop that boy from wearing your black patent leather shoes. It's not going to look right. So I would always go outside and preach, and I went outside this one day to preach, and I'm preaching my heart out with my grandmother's dish rag, which is stiffened because it's been dried by the wind. And I'm preaching my heart out, and then I start hearing comments from the kids in the neighborhood. That's gay. That's strange. What are you doing? You're a preacher and you're wearing heels and you're a man. And so I ran into the house full of tears with my grandfather's Bible in my hand. And I remember saying to my grandma, I'm never playing church again. I'm never doing this again. And she looked at me and she said, don't you ever allow people to make you doubt who you are. She looked at me dead in my face and she said, when your grandmother was born, this is my great-grandmother, when your grandmother was born, she was born out of wedlock and I was a teenage mom, and this was in the 40s. And when I told my family and my church members that I was pregnant, they said to me immediately, you have to stand before the church and apologize. And she asked, well, is the guy going to apologize? And they said, no, just you. And she talked about the way that people shunned her. And she said, I'll be damned if I go and apologize to some people who have no hell or heaven to put me in. And for that reason, she stopped going to church. But she raised me to understand that the true message of Jesus was not one of condemnation. That was religion's problem. That was Constantinian Christianity. She didn't say that. That's what I learned when I went to school. But she was trying to help me to understand that there is a God beyond the Bible. that book that you hold in your hand is written by human beings, that there is a God beyond the religious tradition that has been created by even black people as a form of survival. And so the next Sunday, I remember going to church and continuing to go to church, thinking that this message translated into the church. But slowly but surely, the message came. It was a Sunday morning, and it was a sermon about Sodom and Gomorrah, about how God destroyed this city because of homosexual interactions. But I always found it very interesting that when preachers would preach this text, they would talk about the fact that Sodom and Gomorrah was hypothetically destroyed because of homosexuality, which is not true. The Bible actually says it was because of fullness of bread. They were greedy, living like America, throwing tons of food away while they were celebrating. But we also eclipse the fact that the holy man in the text, Lot, gave his virgin daughter over for men to enjoy her body without her consent. And we never focus on the patriarchy in the text as being one of the reasons why this land was destroyed, instead of the fact that there were persons who were lovers of the same sex in the same city. And I remember hearing this message while also hearing the words of my grandmother. E. Patrick Johnson said, everything I learned about being queer, I learned from my grandmother who loved me. I remember hearing this sermon, but then hearing the words of my grandmother, and hearing this sermon, and then hearing the words of my grandmother, and I settled and said, he's wrong. I didn't say it out loud. I said it in my head, he's wrong. I will not accept this. I know better. I know what God showed me. I remember going back home that evening and looking in the mirror and having visions and dreams about being a pastor, but also being married to a man. About that being accepted. And I remember saying to God, how can this happen? If I hear this from my grandmother, I just can't have my grandmother in my church. She's going to die one day, and I need somebody to help us to run the thing. What must I do? And I remember God saying to me in that moment, that's what I sent you here to do. And I thought, what in the world? That's what I sent you here to do. That's what I sent you here to do. I had an aunt who has been married to a woman my entire life of 37 years. And she handed me a book when she saw me as a young one. And I guess she could tell that there was a little flair there. She said, here's a book that I want you to read. Now, keep in mind, I am in middle school, and this book is by Peter Gomes from Harvard Memorial Church, who is titled The Good Book. He was the first out queer minister of Harvard Memorial Church. And I remember perusing through this book words that I could not understand, but I knew that this man was out and gay and pastoring a church. So I said, I want to study with him. Not only do I want to study with him, but I want to read everything that he's read. I want to educate myself because, yes, it is true that we cannot destroy the master's house with the master's tools, but being able to understand how those tools functions gives us the ability to use our subversiveness to destroy them completely. So I went and I educated myself, and one of the things that I was always told is that they will never work in the black church because the black church is innately homophobic. Black people are innately homophobic. That white stuff where these gay people are running around with flags, that's in white communities, that's in white liberal churches, that will never happen in black churches. And so I started doing research. And I found out that it is a lie that black people are innately homophobic. Where are you getting that from? I'm getting it from the research when I found out that in West Africa, which is where many of the enslaved persons came from when they were brought treacherously into this country, that in West Africa, persons that we would label as LGBTQIAP+, but particularly transgender persons, were not demonized, but were considered sacred conduits to the spirit world in these indigenous traditions. And so the question becomes, if the people of West Africa had a concept of the inclusivity and diversity and belonging that we are trying to create in America here today, then how and where did black homophobia come from? Well, the transatlantic slave trade. When enslaved Africans were captured and brought into this land, the first iteration of homophobia, or the idea that same-sex interaction was bad, actually came in the form of reprimand. When males that they described as bucks were seen as being very strong in nature and trying to go press their way towards freedom, the slave owners would bring them into the slave yard and call all of the enslaved to stand around as they sodomized the male. The first instance of this idea of same-sex interaction being wrong is planted in the minds of black people through slavery, that this is what we do to you when you seek freedom, and labeling you in this way. The other thing that I found out is that the very first sermon ever preached against homosexuals in the black community was actually in Harlem at the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, New York. It started because there was a group of white housewives living in Harlem as the Great Migration was going on, and blacks were coming from the South. And blacks did not at that time have the nightlife that is so robust and known with Harlem now, with Harlem's history. And so rent parties were hosted by drag queens and by queer women and queer men, and the black middle class would go and celebrate with drinks and entertainment in the apartments and homes of queer people. There was an interesting intermingling and acceptance of diversity, but then these white housewives who were trying their best to keep their neighborhood from being gentrified, it sounds like what continues to happen today, they wrote terrible op-eds in the New York Times saying things like, these black people are coming up like beasts. The women are dressing like men and the men are dressing like women. And because of this, we must protect our children. The language of queer people being an attack on the family predates John Dobson and Focus on the Family. It actually goes back to Harlem in 1911. And so as a result of this, many of the black leaders in the Urban League, including Adam Clayton Powell Sr., he wanted so badly for the black body to be viewed as civil. And so for the sake of maintaining the civility of black people, he forced black people to stop attending these rent parties and launched from the Abyssinian pulpit a campaign against homosexuality, all for the purpose of making black people look civil to the white gaze. When I realized this, I realized that the way to queer the black church is to rid it of its whiteness, because it is white theology masquerading itself as black church in our black churches that causes us to reject our own when they come unto us. But then I'll give you this one last example, because there may be some biblical scholars in the room who are thinking, well, you've given all of this cultural critique. Give me a biblical example to explain this inclusivity that you claim to be your calling in life. Well, it's a story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch in the book of Acts chapter 8. There is a eunuch who is a wealthy man. He is Queen Candace's secretary, managing her fiduciary matters. And he is traveling from Ethiopia, and here he is in a very fine chariot reading Isaiah. And one of the great leaders of the early church, according to the book of Acts, sees this eunuch reading this text. Now, you must understand that eunuchry in the biblical era were those persons who did not fit into the gender binary. They say that Jesus never talked about sexuality. Yes, he did. That's a lie. Jesus said for those who are eunuchs, somebody asked him, what are we to do with those persons? Many of whom would fit into the acronym of LGBTQIP+. Jesus says, for those who can minister unto them, let them. For those who do not see that as their ministry, leave them alone. This is in Matthew chapter 25. So when Philip sees this man, he begins to extend to him the gospel message. And he responds to Philip and says, well, you talked about baptism. There's a pool of water. What is to prevent me from being baptized? Philip said to him, nothing. One of the reasons in Leviticus, the reason they were able to profile eunuchs before they came into the temple is because often it was noticeable that they were eunuchs. And no doubt Philip recognized who this eunuch was and realized some aspects of that eunuch story. But Philip absolutely positively opens up the arms of the church family and the Christian faith to this person. So Christian traditions who do not do such are the Antichrist. Thank you.
That was amazing. I learned so much. Thank you so much. I'm now going to invite you all, our guest speakers, to come join me on these comfortable, beautiful couches. And for you all, we're going to do some questions, and I'd love to hear from you all. Let's give them another round of applause as we go into our... Brandon coming. Okay, so I have a question here that we were thinking of to ask you all, because we were looking at all of the great work that we have with the Portraits of Pride. And you were very emotional, got me emotional, all around. I would love to hear what it was like for you, what the experience was like seeing yourself standing 10 feet tall in the heart of the city, and why a project like this is so important. I would love to start with you, Candace, and share your thoughts about this amazing project.
Yeah, so I will be honest, I was very nervous about the process because we would spend like about an hour with this photo shoot and we don't get to choose our photos. And so as a trans person, a lot of gender dysphoria happens, especially like on my best days, I'll probably still feel like I'm clockable, right? Can people tell? Will that expose any harm to me? And so when the promo started coming out, I was like, oh gosh, I already don't like my photo, the little yellow dress, and I just didn't feel comfortable because I'm like, wow, like everyone is seeing this, what can they see? And then I was hosting the kickoff, and so I slowly walked over to Jean when he was setting up, and I saw this photo in red, and I was like, oh my goodness. I felt stunning, I felt beautiful, and a little part of me was still kind of nervous because it's sitting right in front of the place I work, so I didn't know like, oh, are people gonna treat me differently because it says Portraits of Pride, right? And so, but it didn't matter because there were so many people there to celebrate, and I remember seeing you all in passing, and I was like, oh my gosh, like everything was just so beautiful just to see.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to share their experience?
I think I'll say that the feeling I had is that I was that little boy looking in the mirror again, and that I had the opportunity to see the promised land, and unlike Moses who struck the rock, I was able to go into the promised land. But I think the other thing that I felt is that, well, I'm in this promised land, but there are a lot of people still in captivity. And so maybe, because my husband will tell you, when we first got the call, I said, well, I don't know if we're going to do that, honey. I don't think we're going to do that. And he really was the one who was persuading me, because I've always been very careful about not wanting to be anybody's face of something. Also because I don't fully sometimes trust the white regime that is behind the queer community often, and the way that they like to utilize black faces. So I was very concerned about that and what that meant. I don't really have an allegiance to the flag either. I know we've now added the brown in there too, but as a black person, flags make me very nervous in general because they represent certain types of empire that I am never focused on trying to support. So, but in that moment when I was watching it, I was glad that I listened to my husband. I should always listen to my husband. I was glad that I listened to my husband because so many people came and said to me, you know, the type of representation and what that means to other young people who would see it. And I thought to myself, well, what if I had seen something like this in my 11-year-old self after I had that moment in my bathroom?
For me, as an outsider, knowing that this project's going on, I follow Jean on LinkedIn, and I was thinking, this is amazing. And for my story of my family in Puerto Rico, I was just sharing with James today that it was such a challenging time for Puerto Rican and to understand, very similar to you, Candace, that they just had different ideas for us and different what their looked like. But I was watching this work happen. I was thinking, that's amazing. I'm going to bring mommy and papi so they can see these pictures and so they can see, because there's this fear sometimes for us too and from our families and understanding that. So I can understand what it would be like for someone else to see some of these portraits. So it's beautiful. So Candace, I'm gonna stick with you for just a little bit longer because we have some questions specifically for Candace from the audience, which I think would be really great too. One about your mom, and when did your mother, and what did it take for her to use the correct pronouns now?
I like that y'all assume that she's still using the correct pronouns.
Great correction.
Yeah, no,
thinking, I guess.
You're totally fine. It's so funny because I think, I'm 30 now, and I transitioned, or began my transition about 25. And so for 25 years, she's only known me as her son. And I can't fault her for that because I think I look at the other ways that she supported me as like a performer. Like she doesn't put any curfews or allows anything to happen. And it's sometimes I just brush it off. I think there's been harmful conversations where my brother got married in 2021, and I presented at Candace then, and she's going around like, oh my gosh, look at my son, isn't he so beautiful? I mean, she got that part right, but
the beautiful part right, yes.
Clearly.
And I've asked her, like, what do you say when people do ask? Because people start to ask, like, oh, what? I thought you had a son, or I thought you had 3 sons, and then she'll just say, oh no, that's like my niece, and like. Pre-Candace moved away or something like that. So I think she needs to learn how to cope with that, but it's growing, I guess.
Yeah, it's still a journey. Thank you for sharing that. I have a question, and this is related to, because I would love to hear your thoughts on what we're doing here at the Museum of Science also, that why is it important for institutions like the Museum of Science in Boston to celebrate and support the community year-round? It's not just about the June month. And really, what would you say to that, to know that we want to amplify our voices? Winelia, I'll start with you. And
Yeah. I mean, I think the way that I would say it, I think especially in a place like Massachusetts and like Boston in particular, we're beyond identity at this point. And when I say beyond, I don't mean that people's individual lived experiences and the layering of that matters, because it still does, very much so. But when you think about this city and this state as an ecosystem, the governance coalition looks very different than the rest of the country. Right? Which means that the ability to do more is here. And I think that the more that institutions like the Museum of Science and others that exist in the civic sector, right, whether that's hospitals, the finance sector, and other big industries, you need to show up right now, because in many ways, I'll make this very specific to Beacon Hill. Beacon Hill is just stuck in a charade of just what they do, and cities and towns have been left to, manage on their own, and they have been for a very long time, especially for cities and towns that have Black and brown populations, that have populations that are dealing with equity issues that are different than, the monolith of Massachusetts, right? So what I would say is that the reason why it's so important is that it pushes the envelope at a meta picture, at a meta level for the state. Because the truth is that for too long, we've been too happy with just having a parade or getting a month, right? And I think that Massachusetts, as always, has a lot to show in terms of like what it can be doing in the country, and not just giving us marketing campaigns about how good it is to feel to be here. I'm not talking about the Museum of Science in that case, to be clear. But I think it pushes the envelope more when institutions like this make it part of the foundation and not just part of a, part of a month. So.
Yeah. Candace, I'm going to excuse you now so that you can go and prepare. We have a special performance later, so I want to make sure Candace has plenty of time. I'm excited for that. So also, when we're talking about our work, and there's a question here about payroll and processing payroll and using correct pronouns or dead names, and that's something that's really challenging. But I will share that being at the Museum of Science, and in my role, it'll be 2 years in September. And I was sharing with you, Doctor, that I came from the Family Health Center in Worcester, where, again, human resources, and really in the neighborhood of which we want to serve, and really talking about health equity. And I was able to translate that to workplace equity and with our staff. So my question to you all is, again, with this idea of the institution, is how is it that we here can help our places of work? Or how is it that you're able to talk about everything going on in the church and make these changes? We realize that it doesn't take just one person. It does take policies and process and education. I didn't know, sharing your experiences with the institutions as well on how to do that. If you want to start, Doctor.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really critical for LGBTQ+ people to be represented in all workplaces. In my own field of medicine, first of all, we're the most fun people at work, and so we're a blast to have around.
Wait, the doctors are the most fun?
No, the LGBTQ+ people. We doctors are generally quite boring, which is why
I was going to say, I don't remember that part. But
this infusion of joy is so important. But in my own field, it is so important because we do a lot of things. So I've already spoken a little bit about how just our mere representation in the field is important, especially when we're working with patients and families and children for whom it's important to see people LGBTQ+ people thriving and in positions where they are helping and giving back. I think the other way that we have been, I think, very important as a group has been to drive the field forward. And so in terms of the medicine that is now available to LGBTQ+ people, and in particular gender-affirming care, that largely was born out of the work of people who were part of the community, really sort of driving that work forward, driving the research forward, and making the advancements happen when others wouldn't do that work.
Yep, thank you. Anyone else want to add?
Well, I want to say that I always get a little leery when institutions and organizations start this diversity, belonging, and inclusion conversation. Because oftentimes it manifests as a form of tokenism, that you want to get certain people but not too many of them in the place, or you're trying to market what you are offering to get Black people in a space for Black History Month, or queer people in a space for Pride Month in June. And I'm not so sure that that is what DEI work really needs to continue to focus on. I see a lot of performative justice in these departments. These positions are popping up all over the place. What I would like to see is us doing the systematic work of both not trying to get Black people in a space, or not trying to get queer people in the space, but educating white people and heteronormative people through the offerings that you do, because that's where the change needs to be. Like, we don't need to be in your places. We don't need to be in these different spots. I do understand the element of affirmative action and making sure that equality is there, but I do worry about the performative justice that happens. For instance, if we're gonna talk about diversity, we need to bring in the history and the ways in which many institutions, even the medical community, has gynecology is birthed on the backs of Black women without anesthesia. Maybe teaching these parts of our history becomes a very important part, but I think sometimes institutions don't want to face history.
Right. Agreed.
Or the role that they've had in it.
Yeah, and I'll build off of that because that's what I do for a living. Work with institutions to actually take them through the journey, and that's why a lot of the biggest lesson is the patience, right? But I'm with you with everything that you've shared up till now. But what I will say, more specifically in my case, right, is that it's hard, right? Because I am an LGBTQ professional, but that identity is not what brings me into the door. To be clear. It's the multiplicity of my identities, first of all, but most importantly, it's the fact that I'm a weaver. I'm in the room because I'm either a content expert and I'm a master facilitator, right? So what does that look like? I'm working with, the Boston Transit Department in their planning and their public works team. I'm working with BPDA in their development and planning review team alongside different projects because I'm obsessed with making equity structured. I just don't want a community meeting. I don't just want a report that says that they're going to do nice things. I want data that actually is actionable. It's why what I talked about today about people like me being seen as non-technical experts on the expert team. And now that there's DEI standards that have emerged in places like Boston and Massachusetts and the like, it's good to some degree because it does open the door where it wouldn't be otherwise, but the institutions aren't ready yet. Right? And that's why it's about change management and it's about professional development. And I'm not talking about a training, right? It's about how do we have a culture where we're also promoting people to do the self-ecology work, so you're not showing up to work expecting your workplace to do everything for you in terms of learning that history, learning what that context is. Because I do think sometimes we live in a society, especially in this country, where if I don't learn it, if I didn't read it, then I'm not responsible. As a queer woman, as an immigrant woman, as a woman of color, I don't get that choice. I don't get that choice ever. So for me, it's like, when do we start building a real culture in this country where we all have to actually learn from each other and unlearn our own cultures, right? And it doesn't mean you let go or you stop being who you are, because I'm always gonna be Dominican and Puerto Rican and nothing ever gonna change that. I've just learned how to speak a little slower when I'm in mixed company.
That's a gift.
It's practice every day. It's still practice, right? But I share that because I think that it's always about discernment, right? Because, intellectually, I'm anti-imperialist, I'm all these other things, but I believe in systems. Because at the end of the day, we are people that live in our homes, in our apartments, or in our or want to, and people need services. And their services need to be met every day.
I love that. And it's a struggle. The Museum of Science, it's 193 years young today. And the history that the Museum of Science, and my position is new. My position is what you're talking about, the performative position. I'm a Latina, obviously white presenting Latina, and the only person of color on the C-suite, right? So a lot of times they do look at me on a regular basis and say, what are we gonna do for Black History Month, 𝗍𝗿𝗁? Right? That's not what. So, but we're growing. We are growing. And we understand 193 years young, it's not going to be fixed, or not fixed, or it's not going to grow into something different tomorrow. But with all of that said, I still love the work that we're doing, and I completely understand where you're coming from. And there is this idea of tokenism sometimes, but it's the Museum of Science being open. And we're working through that. We have one more question from an audience member, which I think is a really great way to end, so that then we can come to our performance. And I'm going to start with you, Reverend. Is if you had 3 words to tell your younger self, what would they be?
3 words or 3 phrases?
It says words.
Okay.
3. 3 palabras solamente. 3 palabras.
Yeah. Saying that to a Black Baptist preacher.
I know, that's hard. I'm like,
I'm going to switch it to phrases.
I
think the first thing.
You can.
I think the first thing I would say, tell myself, is that what you saw will come to pass. I would also tell myself to be patient, and I would also probably tell myself to be more careful with yourself.
Thank you. Renelia?
This is a tough one.
And Doctor, you have the most time to think about it.
I would say that, I don't know if it's 3 words, but I'm just going to say a sentence to myself. Your dreams weren't that crazy.
Yeah. Oh, say that again. People say what?
Your dreams weren't that crazy.
And for you to close this out?
Win with kindness.
Thank you. A round of applause. Thank you to you all. Jean had asked me in the beginning when we were backstage, he says, and someone else says, is this part of your job description? Is this what you get to do? It's not, but I do get to participate in some of these amazing events with James. And this has been one of my favorite events this evening. Thank you so much. This is an absolute pleasure to have you here. And thank you for all of you for coming this evening. And now we get to have Candace perform for us right now.
This a reminder. This a reminder.
What's up, hot? You do? Yeah, I'm built this. We never. No stress, Renaissance, yes. Hurt to the feminine one. Oh! To the feminine one. Oh!
This a reminder.
Damn, I love the burning of the dagger from the words that you say. Fuck yeah. Dancing in the mirror, kiss my scars because I love what they make. Ooh, yeah. She's a god, she's a hero. She survived all she been through. Confident, damn, she lethal. Might I suggest you don't fuck with my sis? Cause she comfortable. Comfortable in my skin. Cozy with who I am. Comfortable in my skin. Cozy. Cozy. Comfortable in my skin. Cozy with who I am. I love myself, goddamn. Cozy. 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 I'm juicy. I'm juicy. You hate me. You hate me. Cause you want me. Cause you want me. I'm swaggy. I'm swaggy. Effortlessly. Effortlessly. Now God made me. So bitch, pay me. So pay me.
Do not be alarmed, remain calm. Do not attempt to leave the dance floor. The DJ booth is conducting a troubleshoot test of the entire system.
I'm one of one. I'm number one. I'm the only one. Don't even waste your time trying to compete with me. No one else in this world can think like me. I'm twisted, how contradicted. Keep him addicted. Lies on his lips, I lick it. Unique. That's what you are. Stilettos kicking vintage crystal off the bar. Category, bad bitch, I'm the bar. Alien superstar. Whip, whip. Unicorn is the uniform you put on. Eyes on you when you perform. Eyes on I when I put on. Masterminded, haute couture. Label horse can't clock, I'm so obscure. Masterpiece, genius. Grip, intravenous. Patty cake on there is Tiffany blue billboards over the ceiling. We don't like plain. Always dreamed of paper planes. How high when I rodeo, then I come down and take off again. You see pleasure in my glare. Look over my shoulder and you ain't scared. The effects you have on me when you stare. Head on a pillow, hike it in the air. Time
drop it.
Looking so crazy, my baby.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. To remind everyone, we do have some refreshments, and you're all welcome to go downstairs and enjoy yourselves. Hopefully you'll stick around. Have a great evening. Thank you.